Ancient humans reportedly fought off predators through raw strength and courage alone. That's an easy belief since humans ended up ruling the food chain, but the human body was never built to win that kind of fight. Picture standing at a riverbank at dusk as something pauses just past the firelight, watching. A creature built like that should have ended things in seconds. So why didn't it? The answer isn't what anyone expects. Early human bodies carried no claws, no fangs, and no real speed advantage. Thin skin, a digestive system built for variety over raw power, night vision that fades fast once the sun drops. That absence alone should have been fatal within a generation. Donna Art of the University of Missouri, Saint Louis, and Robert Sussman of Washington University in St. Louis spent years examining bite marks and puncture damage preserved on hominin fossils. Their analysis indicates that predation on early humans and their close relatives may have been frequent rather than rare, especially across certain regions and time periods. Hominin, in case that word feels unfamiliar, simply refers to the group of upright walking ancestors that eventually led to modern humans. That one finding quietly flips the whole story. Most people already assume they know. If danger was that constant, survival was never mainly about winning a fight. It was about noticing one coming early enough to avoid it, over and over, for generation after generation, until noticing became closer to instinct than choice. Researchers now describe that constant awareness as a landscape of fear, a mental map layered over the physical one, marking which places carried risk and which ones felt safer. Nobody wrote it down. It lived in memory, passed from older group members to younger ones through habit rather than instruction. Picture a small band moving toward a river as the light starts to fade. Someone near the back slows first, then stops, eyes fixed on a patch of reeds that just moved wrong. A hand goes up. No words. The whole group shifts course, trading a shorter path for a longer one that keeps distance from whatever is in there. That small, almost invisible decision, repeated across thousands of lives, may not be a footnote in this story. It might be the main event. Notice what didn't happen in that scene at all. Nobody fought anything. Nobody proved anything. Who? The encounter was already over the moment the group changed direction. Since the predator never got a chance to test them at all, that's a strange kind of win. The kind that never shows up in a dramatic retelling. Because there's nothing dramatic to show. Here's a small detail that made scenes like that possible in the first place. And it's easy to miss. Someone had to actually be watching. Not everyone, and not constantly, since that would have exhausted a group within days. Researchers studying vigilance behavior in social primates have documented a simple pattern that likely applied here too. Watch duty rotated. One or two people stayed alert while others rested, ate, or cared for children, then traded off. That kind of rotating attention meant a group could stay reasonably alert around the clock without any single person carrying the entire burden alone. It sounds almost too simple to matter. Yet, without it, that riverbank scene falls apart completely. Since a group with nobody watching the reeds never gets the warning at all, that instinct only carries a group so far on its own. Though, rivers still needed crossing. Night still fell, whether shelter was ready or not. And avoiding every threat during the day still says nothing about what happened once the sun went down, which turns out to be a much harder problem to solve. Harvard anthropologist Richard Wrangham has spent much of his career studying the controlled use of fire, and part of his research focuses on something people rarely consider: sleep before fire. Resting on open ground overnight was an enormous risk in many predator-dense environments. Tree sleeping offered some protection, the way it still does for several primates today, but it also limited group size and the kind of deep rest a larger, more energy-hungry brain seems to need. Wrangham's work suggests fire changed more than diet. It appears to have functioned as a nightly boundary, a wall of light and heat that most large predators are reluctant to cross. Ground sleeping became survivable. Groups could grow larger, since more bodies near one fire meant more warmth and more eyes watching and rotating shifts through the night. Picture that fire as the actual center of the story for a second. Bodies close to the flame. Someone else feeding in another branch. Eyes lifting occasionally to check the dark tree line just beyond reach. That circle of light wasn't only warmth, it was the edge between a world that could be somewhat managed and a world that absolutely couldn't. That solved the night. It solved almost nothing about what happened when danger showed up in broad daylight, at close range, with no fire anywhere nearby. That part of the story needed a completely different answer, and it arrived later than most people assume. Keeping that fire going wasn't automatic either. And this is where another small, unglamorous habit comes in. Someone had to gather fuel before dark and feed the flame through the night without letting it die down. And notice early, if it started to weaken, that job likely rotated the same way watch duty did, turning fire maintenance into one more shared responsibility, rather than a task for a single person to carry alone. Miss it once, on the wrong night, and the whole boundary that had been keeping a group safe simply disappears. Fire didn't only guard the night, either, it sharpened the daylight defenses too. Hardening a wooden spear tip briefly over hot coals makes the point denser and considerably harder to snap on impact. A simple technique that shows up across multiple early tool traditions. That one trick turned a basic sharpened stick into something closer to a real weapon, and it likely mattered just as much for defense as it did for hunting. Choosing where to build that fire in the first place mattered just as much as keeping it lit. A camp tucked against a rock face or a steep slope only needed watching on the open sides, cutting the number of directions a threat could approach from nearly in half. High ground helped too, since it let a lookout see further and gave any predator less cover to close the distance unnoticed. None of that required any special insight. It just required paying attention to the same landscape every single day until the safest spots became obvious through repetition rather than theory. Move camp often enough, and even that pattern recognition had to start over, which may be part of why certain sheltered, defensible locations were returned to again and again across many generations, long after any single group that first found them was gone. Research associated with the Smithsonian's Human Origins program traces stone-tipped projectile weapons back roughly 400,000 years, possibly earlier for certain wooden spear technologies. That shift from tools requiring close contact to weapons that could injure something from several body lengths away may be one of the most underrated turning points in this entire story. Before it, defending against a determined predator meant being close enough to be hurt. After it, a group could deter or wound a threat while staying outside the reach of claws and jaws entirely. There's a quieter piece of that toolkit too, one that almost never gets credit. Twisted plant fiber, turned into simple cordage, let early humans bind stone, points to wooden shafts, securely enough to survive real impact rather than shattering on first contact. It also made basic traps and snares possible, tools that didn't require anyone to be present the moment a threat actually triggered them. Unglamorous, maybe, but without it, several flashier advances would have had a much shorter useful life. Distance wasn't the only advantage working in humans' favor either. In research published in the journal Nature, Daniel Lieberman of Harvard University and Dennis Bramble of the University of Utah proposed that human bodies are unusually well built for sustained endurance running, thanks to efficient whole-body sweating and long, spring-like tendons most other mammals lack. A predator that relies on short, explosive bursts of speed can often be outlasted, not outrun, by something willing to keep moving long after the faster animal needs to stop and recover. None of that explains one more piece of the puzzle, though the piece that ties every other advantage together. Fire, weapons, endurance, and watch duty all depend on one thing working correctly: the ability to warn each other fast enough for any of it to matter. A raised hand only works up close. Sound travels further, faster, and around obstacles. A hand signal never could. Coordinated group vocalizations, the distinct alarm calls used to mark different kinds of danger, appear across a wide range of primate species already, which suggests early humans likely built on a communication system that was already partly in place, long before anything resembling full language existed. A single sharp call could warn an entire group scattered across a wide area in a fraction of a second, something no amount of strength or speed could ever replicate on its own. Different calls for different threats would have mattered too, since the correct response to something moving through tall grass is not the same as the correct response to something circling from above. A group that could tell those calls apart, even with a handful of distinct sounds, effectively gained a shared early warning system that worked, whether or not everyone happened to be looking in the right direction at the right moment. Stack all of that together, and the picture still feels incomplete somehow. Awareness, fire, distance weapons, endurance, communication. None of it explains why predators, animals with every physical advantage on paper, you would eventually choose to avoid humans altogether, rather than testing them again and again until the odds finally worked out. That part of the story is the one most people never even think to ask about. Here's the twist. Predators aren't driven by anger or grudges or a desire to prove anything. Most large carnivores are, underneath everything, deeply risk-averse, because their entire survival depends on a functioning body. A lion with even a moderately damaged leg or jaw can lose the ability to hunt effectively. And in the wild, that often means a slow decline toward starvation rather than a dramatic death. Picture it from the predator's side for a moment. Since that angle rarely gets told, a hungry animal approaches a group at dusk and sizes them up the same way it would size up any other potential meal. But this particular group doesn't scatter, it tightens together, throws something sharp that draws blood before any claw makes contact, and lights up the dark with fire and noise on top of it. That single failed attempt costs real tissue, real energy, and a real chance of infection with no guarantee of healing. A second attempt against a different, easier target starts looking a lot more sensible. That decision, repeated across countless similar encounters, is not cowardice. It's basic risk math, playing out one careful animal at a time. Multiply that single encounter across an entire region and an entire lifetime of a predator population. And the pattern compounds on itself over time. A predator that survives one bad encounter with a human group tends to remember it in whatever way an animal remembers anything, and adjusts its hunting range accordingly. Over enough generations of predators making that same adjustment, entire regions can shift gradually from actively hunting humans to simply avoiding them by default. Not because any single confrontation was ever decisive, but because the accumulated cost of testing humans kept outweighing the reward. Early humans, whether or not they understood any of the biology behind it, appear to have shifted that calculation without needing to win a single fight outright. A group with fire, with distance weapons, with tight coordination, simply stopped being worth the gamble. That's the detail that quietly rewrites everything. Survival didn't come from being the strongest thing in the landscape. It came from making the cost of testing that strength too high to bother trying. There was probably no single dramatic showdown behind any of this. The real turning point was quieter, closer to a slow accumulation of near misses that never happened. Encounters avoided so consistently that predators in a region gradually adjusted their own habits. An animal doesn't need conscious reasoning to learn that a certain kind of prey keeps ending badly for it. From a distance, that can look like humans simply stopped being afraid What more likely happened is the opposite. Humans stayed just as cautious as ever. The predators were the ones who changed. The same defensive pattern shows up again in communities that still live alongside large predators today, in places with no historical contact between them. Coordinated group movement, controlled fire at night, and deliberate noise, used to discourage an approaching predator, appear again and again across very different cultures. That kind of repetition, arrived at independently, usually signals something closer to a discoverable pattern than a rare stroke of genius. A solution nearly any sufficiently social, sufficiently observant group of primates could eventually work out given enough close calls. That repetition matters for another reason too. It means none of this depended on one especially clever population getting lucky and passing down a secret. Nearly identical solutions, showing up on different continents among groups that never met, points towards something closer to a shared, discoverable answer to a shared problem, rather than a rare flash of brilliance that happened to spread. None of it would have mattered much, though, without a way to pass it forward. Generation after generation. Long after the people who first worked any of it out were gone. Picture an older member of the group crouched beside a child near the edge of camp, pointing at a faint disturbance in the dirt. A broken stem. A print half filled with dust. No formal lesson. No explanation beyond a few words and a gesture. Just repetition. Over years. Until the child could read the same signs without being told what to look for. That kind of quiet, informal teaching almost never survives in the archaeological record. Since it leaves no tools behind and no bones to examine, it may still be one of the most important pieces of this entire story, since every advantage described so far, the fire, the weapons, the watch rotations, the alarm calls, only kept working because someone kept teaching the next generation how to use them. That's easy to overlook entirely, since it doesn't come with a fossil or a name attached to it. But a group that mastered fire once and then lost the knowledge within a generation gained nothing lasting. Survival depended just as much on that unglamorous transfer of knowledge as it did on any single tool or trick. A weapon without someone left to explain how to use it is just a sharpened stick lying in the dirt. There's one more piece of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it has less to do with weapons than with childhood. Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, of the University of California, Davis, has argued in her research on cooperative breeding that human infants needed far more sustained care than most primate infants, unable to cling, walk, or feed themselves for years rather than months. That extended helplessness likely pulled in caregivers beyond just a parent, since no single adult could realistically watch for predators, gather food, and meet every need of a fully dependent infant at the same time. That shared responsibility for the most helpless members of a group may have reinforced the exact same trust that made coordinated group defense possible in the first place. A group that already trusted a neighbor to help carry and feed a child it didn't give birth to was a group that had already practiced the exact kind of reliance a sudden threat at the riverbank would demand a moment later. Turn that helplessness around for a second, and it stops looking like pure liability at all. A group forced to share the work of raising its most vulnerable members may have built the same cooperative habits it needed to survive everything else circling just beyond the firelight. None of this should be mistaken for some purer, easier version of existence. Life expectancy across most of human prehistory was almost certainly far shorter than it is now. Infant mortality appears to have been high, and a minor injury without anything resembling modern wound care could turn fatal within days. Whatever safety early humans found here was always relative, never absolute, and it came at an enormous, mostly unrecorded cost. This also didn't unfold the same way everywhere at once. Different regions carried different predator pressures and different access to stone, fuel, and water. So some populations likely crossed that safety threshold well before others did. and a few groups may have faced setbacks that pushed the threshold further out of reach for generations at a time. Put the pieces back together for a moment. A physically unremarkable animal made it by noticing danger early, turning fire into a nightly boundary, hardening its weapons in that same fire, choosing defensible ground to camp on, learning to injure a threat from a distance instead of up close, outlasting faster animals over long stretches, warning each other fast enough for any of it to matter, teaching each generation how all of it worked, and trusting a group tightly enough that scattering never felt like the safer option. None of that required strength in the way strength usually gets pictured. It required attention, patience, and people willing to rely on each other, day after day, for far longer than any single lifetime could cover on its own. That same instinct never really switched off. It just changed targets. The tightening in a chest walking through an unfamiliar parking garage at night, the reflex to glance twice at sudden movement, the discomfort of an unlit street with no clear line of sight. All of it traces back to the same wiring that once kept a small group alive near a watering hole. Nobody had to teach a modern brain to feel uneasy in the dark. That feeling arrived already built in, inherited rather than learned. From a version of that same landscape of fear that never fully faded even after the predators that justified it mostly disappeared, the landscape changed completely. The mental map underneath it barely changed at all. It's late in Houston right now. Isn't it wild? That same instinct is probably still quietly running in the background for someone reading this, without them noticing it at all. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt once put it, the only thing to fear is fear itself. There's something fitting about that line landing here. Since this story was never really about overcoming fear, it was about learning to use it, shaping it into patience and timing precise enough to outlast animals that were faster, stronger, and better armed in almost every way that mattered. So, no. Ancient humans never really fought off predators through raw strength and courage alone. They barely had either one to spare, and it turned out they never actually needed them in the first place.